I started signing more clients from speaking on podcasts than I was from any other marketing. You literally get to speak directly to your ideal clients for 30 minutes, an hour at a time. The number one thing that makes a really good pitch is showing that you understand what their listeners are going to find valuable and you're pitching an angle that fits that. I've seen people sign clients from tiny, tiny shows. You're like, oh, only, 100 people listen. But if you were standing in a room with 100 people, you'd be practicing that talk. You'd have your slides, you'd have your hair done. It would be an event. Show up to it with that energy.
Being a guest on a podcast is not just about accepting an invite or getting on a show and talking and then saying, see you later, have a nice day, thanks for having me. There's so much more that can come from being a guest on a podcast, especially as it pertains to growing your business. And that's going to be the big theme of our discussion today, because Natalie is one of the foremost experts in helping people get on podcasts in order to grow their business. So Natalie, before we dive headlong into that, give us a quick origin story. How did you get to what you're doing today and helping people get on podcasts?
Yeah, so it was really about walking my walk and then people asking me how I did it. So before starting my business, I was director of partnerships for a nonprofit. So it was all about influencing and putting out angles and media and all that good stuff. So they were kind of skills that I brought with me. And then when I started my business, I started speaking on podcasts just because I thought it'd be fun, if I'm honest, and a good way of kind of getting my name out there. And I started signing more clients from speaking on podcasts than I was from any other marketing, more than social media, more than networking, all of that. And people saw me doing it and started asking me, hey, can you help me get booked on podcasts? And I was like, sure. And then the rest is history. It's been years now.
I love it. All right. So you're walking the walk and people asking you how you do it, and then you start helping them do it. I think there's so many of us have started our businesses that way, where it's like, hey, we actually have a skill here. Let's turn this into a business. People want to give me money for it. Let's go. I love it.
Yeah. Follow the demand. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So the main crux of what you do is helping people get on the podcast as a guest, but not just guesting. You're getting on there with an end goal in mind, and that is to not just borrow an audience, but it gives you a position of authority and it gives you the ability to grow your business. So let's kick this game off with understanding the importance of podcasting beyond just the fact that you're a guest on a podcast. How do you use it to grow your business?
Yeah. So when you're speaking on podcasts, it builds your brand way beyond social media. And there's two main benefits of it. So one is that it positions you as an authority. The host is literally introducing you and putting you in front of a warm audience that already trusts them, that are already choosing to listen to that podcast or all of the millions of other podcasts they could be listening to. So there's an instant transfer of trust there. And it shows up brilliantly, Google, that kind of thing. If somebody Googles your name, all your podcast features are going to be one of the first things that show up, especially now that we're using video and video ranks so well. So even if somebody never listens to a podcast interview that you've given, there's just that perception and that positioning of yourself as an expert, as somebody that people want to listen to, as somebody that people are platforming and sharing with their audience. So that's one. And then the second part is sales and clients and lead gen. So give me an example of another way of marketing that you literally get to speak directly to your ideal clients for 30 minutes, an hour at a time. There just isn't one. So when you're speaking on podcasts, with a bit of thought, you can do it in a way where the stories that you're telling are leading back to your offers. And the examples that you're giving are like just giving glimpses of your expertise and your personality and what it's like to work with you and, all that good stuff. So by the time somebody listens to you for half an hour, they're already warm. So then when they join your email list or they DM you on Instagram and say, hey, how can we work together? They're all in, right? They already have the information they need to be like, yeah, great. They're a great fit. They're my next investment. Let's go.
I can't tell you just from my personal story how many times being on a podcast has led to something positive for me and my business. Mm-hmm. In fact, the fact that I'm even here with MU was because I was on my friend Nick Loper's Side Hustle podcast almost 4 years ago. And that led me to so many connections and clients in my own marketing business, but it led to partnerships like this between me and MU, where if I'm not on that podcast, Justin Williams probably never hears of me, right? Like it was being on that pod that put me on the map. And now that I've been on multiple podcasts, like when you Google me, I show up where the podcast I was on. And like you said, Google and SEO featuring video so heavily, it goes such a long way. So Excellent explanation on how important it is to be a guest on a podcast beyond the fact that you're just there. So one of the themes that we're going to hit on is being in a league of your own via podcasting. So, let's expound a little bit upon the fact that you mentioned how it really gives you that position of authority. I don't know how many people out there have listened to podcasts, but when the person who's either a guest or even the host of the podcast, depending on their format, you hear them, you immediately, there's this thing in your brain where you're just like, well, this person must know what they're talking about. They're on a podcast. The microphone is in front of them, right? What is it about that psyche in our brains that just immediately says, I can trust this person?
So partly that somebody you trusts them, right? Like we know that podcast listeners are loyal. They don't listen to a different podcast every day. They have the same podcast they go back to again and again and again. Like I listen to podcasts at the gym and I literally download it and use it as motivation. All right, I'm not allowed to listen to that podcast until I'm at the gym, so then I actually go to the gym. Do you know, like that?
Yep.
That's kind of how podcast listeners use podcasts. So they're really used to the podcast. They love the host. They trust the host. So it's like if you go to a party and you don't really know anyone, it's so much harder to go around and introduce yourself. Versus if you walk in and you spot somebody you know and they're like, oh my God, it's you, come meet my friend. And then straight away you're in and, the reception's so much warmer and people just feel like they know you. So there's a bit of that. But then there's also the sense that if a podcast host is bringing you on, you kind of have to know your stuff. Like the podcast host isn't going to bring on somebody that, I don't know, opened a book yesterday and is now trying to say that they understand brain science today. That's just not, that's just not going to work. So you kind of know that the people that you're listening to do on some level have expertise that the host thinks is worthy to bring to their audience. So I think it's like some of that as well, like that kind of social proof that it brings.
Spot on. And that's like, if you trust the podcast, you trust the podcast host. If they're bringing this person on, there's already another huge notch on your belt that this guest must know what they're talking about, or else my trusted host would not have brought them on. I love that point.
That's how I met my husband, was through like a mutual friend that said, hey, I know this guy, I think you two would really get on. And so like on our first date, I was so much more open-minded to him than I was, I was doing a lot of internet dating and that kind of thing. And there was a bit of like cynicism and a bit of, oh God, I've had so many crap dates. And, but because my friend had said, no, I think you'd love this guy, I think you'd really get on, I kind of arrived all like relaxed and like wanting to like him.
Yeah.
Whereas, it's that kind of vibe.
Look at that. See, podcast leading to love too. How about that? All right. So let's talk some of the nitty gritty. How does one get on a podcast? I know that that's a broad way to start this topic, but how do you do it? How does someone who owns a business right now, has even a little bit of authority, and they're thinking to themselves, this is a great way for me to start building my business? What's the starting strategy to get off the starting block?
So the simplest way to get booked is to pitch, like to literally do the work, to think of a really compelling angle, something fresh, something a host is going to think is really valuable for their listeners, and make that connection and send the pitch. That's the easiest way of starting out. And then after you've spoken on a few podcasts and after you've grown your personal brand, you'll start getting invitations. So like you were kind enough to invite me to come and speak with you today, which is amazing. But would that have happened 5 years ago? No, I would have had to pitch you and make the case for, why I would be a good guest and why your listeners might find our conversation valuable.
Let's talk about the pitch a little bit. Can you spill the tea for us on what makes a good pitch and what's the best medium to reach out to podcast hosts in order to get on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the number one thing that makes a really good pitch is showing that you understand what their listeners are going to find valuable and you're pitching an angle that fits that. So like for your podcast, you do a kind of mix, right? It's either a personal story of how you built, kind of behind the scenes of your own business growth, or a strategy that you can really help your listeners understand and then implement and play with, or at least understand if it would fit them in their own business. So you want to be pitching a really strong angle. If I was pitching your podcast, I would pitch both of those angles. Like, here's something I've done in my own business. This is why it's interesting or surprising. Here's something that I can help your clients do. That's the number one thing that you need to do. If you've got that, the rest you can kind of play with a bit. And then for medium, I usually use email. That works well. I think it works well because you can give something, with a bit more detail and a bit of thought. and the host or their team can kind of pick it up on their own terms. If you've got some kind of connection with the host, I'd go ahead and DM them, Instagram, LinkedIn, wherever. Or if you can get a mutual connection, like introduction, that's obviously the best. So you're kind of thinking about it from like piping hot, just get the intro. If you're a bit warmer, maybe you can DM. But if you're DMing them, I'd say, something like, hey, I'd love to be a guest on, and then name of their podcast. If you're accepting pitches at the minute, I could talk about, and then keep it super, super short. And then I typically say, if you want me to follow up with an email or something, let me know. And then it kind of just, because people use their inboxes in different ways, don't they? So if they're like more just casual chatting in DMs, they can kind of direct you to where they want you to be.
So, and just a hot tip from a podcast host. So our wonderful EA, Michelle, she handles the incoming requests and pitches to be on our show. And for me, back when I would be on these email chains and see the pitches that come in, a lot of them still come directly to not a lot, some of them come to my email. But if I'm looking to have someone on my show, the best thing that a pitch can contain is a very specific topic that's tailored to our audience, that shows that that person who's pitching us studied who we talk to. They studied the right type of audience that we like to speak to, and then having a very pertinent topic to that audience. So it's basically where the person doing the pitching, if they do half of the heavy lifting for us and they say why they'd be a good guest, I know that this is your audience. Here is why my story or my topic would fit your audience. It can actually be much easier than people think. And we get a lot of, no offense to people, but garbage pitches, right? Like I think every podcast host gets those where it's just, you can tell it's a blanketed shotgun attempt, that this email was sent to, 100 other podcasts and there's no personality injected into it. But if you can put in exactly that, you show that you know the audience and that your topic or story pertains to that audience, that gives you a leg up when you're cold pitching. I'm sure you see those all the time too. So email is probably one of the better ways. And what about consistent follow-up? I know this is amongst cold reach out for anything, but what's your stance on consistently following up if you don't get a response on the first try?
I personally do follow up because I think of it that, hosts are really busy and to you, it might be a priority to, get booked on some podcasts, but for the host, you're never going to be their priority. They're going to do it in their own time, and they might be so well-meaning and think, oh my God, this sounds an amazing pitch, but they've got a client call in 2 minutes and then they just forget to come back to it. We're just busy humans, same as all of us. So I do follow up. I typically give it about 10 days from when I send the first pitch to following up, because I just think I've heard people do it a lot quicker than that. And I think there are pros and cons of both. But for me, it just gives people a chance, it's kind of. And then if it's a podcast that I, really want to be over from, on behalf of clients, it's a really good fit, I'll do one other. And I typically do that a bit closer, so 4 or 5 days for the next one. And in your follow-ups, you want to just make it as easy to say yes as you can. So, just even something like forwarding on the pitch, like, hey, not sure if you had a chance to look at this yet, or, just super casual, super respectful of the host's time. But yeah, I think it is worth following up.
Yeah, absolutely. And
what do you think? I'd love to know as like somebody that receives work.
For sure, yeah. If it's a show that A, you really want to be on, and B, regardless of the size, we have to fill our pipelines for guests, right? Like without our guests, the show dies, if it's a guest podcast type of show. So we're always looking to fill it. Yes, it needs to be filled with the right people. But for those who cold pitch us, the ones who follow up, they do it politely and they do it consistently. At least for me, I'm like this across anything. Like even if someone's coming to, fix the showers or something in our house, the plumber, HVAC, whatever, if they consistently follow up with me, then I know that they care and that they really do want to be on our show, right? That shows me that you've done the work, you've done the effort. And like you said, like we might just be busy and we haven't gotten to your email, or we were about to reply and then we got a call and then the email was left open and we forgot to reply, right? So I appreciate great follow-up, whether I'm a podcast host or just, someone who gets sold to, right? So follow-up, at least for me, is a huge tactical point to being able to get on the shows you want. And podcast hosts, we appreciate it. And if you're the right fit, we let you know. If you're not, we let you know, right? And as somebody who's pitching, it's important to keep trying and trying and trying. And I want to get your opinion while we're still on the topic of pitching. If you're someone who's still newer-ish to owning your business or to entrepreneurship, or you feel like, you don't necessarily have what you need to get on a bigger show. What's your position on just getting booked on any show, even if they have 3 followers? I know where I come from, like, getting on a show is getting on a show, but practice makes better, right? So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I'd agree. And I've seen people find clients from tiny, tiny shows. If you look at the listeners, you're like, oh, only, 100 people listen. But if you were standing in a room of people with 100 people in front of you, you'd be practicing that talk. You'd be having it, you'd think of that as a really legit opportunity. And I mean, I've done it myself. I've seen it with clients. That sometimes those really small shows have such tight-knit communities that they can be amazing for sales because they're so kind of targeted and there's so much trust there that their listeners are like, yep, great, you're who I've been looking for, let's go. So I just think of it in, like if there was 100 people sitting in front of you in a room, you'd have your slides, you'd have your hair done, it would be an event. Yeah. Show up to it with that energy.
Well, and even the smaller shows, it helps you get better at being a guest on a show, right? Like you don't want to just cold walk into a show and start talking. No, I did that. Luckily, it worked out, but I could have been way more prepared and understood what guesting can actually bring. But it gives you a good way to start. And then the more clout you build up, you'd be like, I've been on this show, I've been on this show, I've been on this show. And you start getting the snowball effect. All right. So let's say you've booked your first podcast. You're going to get on there. What's a little bit of strategy to prepare yourself to be on the show, presuming it's a typical interview style podcast?
Yeah, I love it. So first thing you want to do is listen to an episode. You want to know, are there any questions like what's the format in general, but also are there any questions that the host asks every time? So some of them have a teaser or a quick fire round, or you don't want to be caught out with that. You kind of want to have a sense of how it's going to flow. And then beyond that, you want to I always think of it you want enough consistency when you're speaking on every single podcast that if someone Googles you, they're like, oh, it's Natalie. She's talking about speaking on podcasts. Great. She's been talking about speaking on podcasts for years now. Like, she knows her stuff. You don't want them like, oh, one time they're talking about dog training. The next time they're talking about plumbing. Who is this guy? Like, there's such a lack of trust there. So you want to have a really similar topic so they Google you, it's like, doom. Yeah, great. There's all these appearances. But then within that, you don't just want to have the same conversation every time. You want to be talking, share different stories or different anecdotes or, help people see it from a different point of view. Because I hear quite often that listeners literally follow you around your podcast tour and then when they're ready, they hire you. Like they just heard that one thing and they're like, great, now's my moment. I'm in. So yeah, like a bit of flexibility and a bit human, be yourself, just kind of be in the moment, but keep it kind of within your expertise and within what your ideal clients need to hear to move them along that buyer journey.
Absolutely. And then do you recommend, I guess it depends on the person and their business, but should you come prepared to have an offer or something that's tailored to the audience that you're speaking to that day?
I mean, if you really want to go for it, you can tailor something like personal to that podcast. And I think that can be really worth doing for bigger podcasts, especially if it's a podcast that uses the show notes as a blog or, if there's kind of extra levels of SEO and evergreen, that can be a really good move. But typically the best strategy is have one really strong opt-in. If you've got something that's already working well for your business, keep it at that. No need to create something new. If you're creating something new, I always suggest a private podcast because it's the same medium. It works really well for podcast listeners, come over to something else they love. And the benefit is a private podcast is just where they opt in by giving you their email address. So then you're building your email list, you're giving them something really valuable they want to listen to, all that good stuff. And then when you're kind of making the offer on the podcast, I always suggest doing it twice. So you're going to get the opportunity at the end. On 99% of podcasts, the host's going to say, thanks so much, that was amazing. Where can people find you? And then you're going to pitch your offer. You're not going to say, oh, you can come to Instagram or I'm on LinkedIn or you can do this or you can do that. No, you're going to say, think of it as like an offer promise. What is the result they're going to get from your freebie? What is the value proposition? You're going to tell them it and you're going to say it and give them the URL, even though it's going to be in the show notes. And then you also, so that's like your kind of like hard pitch. Think of it like that. And then you can also subtly pitch at some point in the interview. So I would say something like, oh my God, I love this question. I guess I asked it all the time, so much that I made an entire private podcast on it. It's called A League of Your Own. You can get it, nataliekoussa.com/league. But also, let me tell you all about
I see what you did
question.
there.
Yeah, it's just, so you're always giving. You never want to say, oh, for that information, you have to go and give me your email address or whatever. Never do that. Always be super generous and give it all away in the conversation. But you can also just, if people want more, let them know. And then if they don't listen right to the end, they've still had that opportunity.
Let's talk about that real quick since you mentioned it. I love that this would be a great rabbit hole. I think so many people think that when I get on a podcast, especially if you're like, maybe I shouldn't get in specific type of businesses, but like coaches or online or things where, especially if you're teaching people things, the fear that if I go on this podcast, what exactly do I talk about? Am I going to be gating all my stuff? And, what do I say? What do I not say? I'm a proponent of get on a podcast and give it all away, right? Just talk about it as deeply as you possibly can, because one, most people don't take action, sadly, right? And two, if you're willing to talk about it on an in-depth level, there's no air of hiding, right? Or like you said, gating it. But B, you're being polite and saying, if you want more details or you want more information from me on an even deeper level, here's where you go, right? What's your opinion on, or I guess your advice on, people that might be worried about, oh, I'm going to spill my secret sauce?
No, I totally agree with everything you just said, Brian. I think your ideal clients, they're not paying for information, they're paying for the transformation. So we use my business as an example. If I give people everything they need to get pitched, to get booked on their first couple of podcasts, to show up as a decent guest, to maybe even sign their first couple of clients from that, they are such a stronger client to me than somebody who just wants to try podcast guesting and isn't quite sure. And, have them, the more that somebody is kind of rooted in like shared enthusiasm and motivation and kind of commitment to the thing that you offer, the stronger client they're going to be, the better client results they're going to get. And it creates this incredible flywheel, doesn't it? And you've got amazing case studies. They tell their friends that, everything is kind of, on a like upward trajectory. But I think as well, you can't, like, we're going to chat for 40 minutes and I'm going to just answer everything you ask me as, best I can. 40 minutes is nowhere near enough for me to spill all my secrets. It's taken me 5 years to get to this point.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And even if you're new, sure, maybe you think, oh, I'm not even sure what I would talk about for 40 minutes. But you are, because imagine, you have an hour each time you speak to your clients, or you do full deliverables if you're doing, if you're service pro doing done for you. There's going to be so much that you could talk about. You don't need to. It's not like a lecture. It's not a TED Talk. It's a conversation with the host. And the host is going to ask you what they know their listeners are most likely to be interested in. So just let the host lead and have that conversation and give as much as you can away. And you'll get so much more than if you're a bit cagey. I think then you just give the impression you don't know your stuff, or
right,
you're not very likable, or, so there's going to be a little bit of cynicism that you create if you try to sort of barrier it somehow.
Right. And here's the thing. If there are people out there that are taking hardcore notes from your, 40, 50, 60 minutes on a podcast, and they're going to go DIY it and do it themselves, great. You just help that person. If they're capable of DIYing it, that's fantastic. But for the other people who are like, okay, Natalie just gave me all the goods for an hour here. I've got a really cool head start. I might even try some of it on my own, but she did say if I want deeper information or more, connection to her or her team, I can go here. I don't know about you, but the majority of people are probably thinking, this is great, but I want even more help. And that's the whole point. So it's a win-win, because if someone is super hardcore DIY and they took great notes from your show, great, have at it, go for it. But I'll bet you the majority of them too get halfway in and they're like, oh, I still need Natalie's help. I got to go to that landing page and find her, right? So it's a win-win-win for everybody. And it's a great win for the person who, like yourself, has all the information and is able to provide the help.
Yeah. Do you know, this happened to me the other day. On Thread, somebody said, who can help me with podcast guesting? And somebody replied and tagged me, who she's never been my client. I don't know her at all. And she literally said, I listened to Natalie's private podcast, took notes, it's amazing. And tags me. I was like, thanks so much. That's incredible. And she's somebody that, I've never worked with her directly, but she's now in my community and, is getting value from the work I'm putting out there. And
Yeah.
It's great. And then referring other people to me.
Right.
But, you know,
Amazing how that works.
great.
It's a referral tree.
Yeah.
So let's keep moving down the line here and talk about, you get on a podcast, you have a great show. Let's talk about sales or lead gen. What type of strategies do you need to put in place after a show to continue to build rapport either with the host or with the audience you just borrowed?
Yeah, I love this. So there are a few different things you can do. You don't need to do all of these, but even if you just do one of them, it's going to be helpful. First thing, thanking the host afterwards. Like just taking a minute to DM them or email them and just say, thanks so much. I loved, and then to pull out something from the conversation and just asking, like, is there anything I can do to support you? Something like that. It is really helpful. Directly after you wrap, a great question for the host can be, do you know any other podcasts that would love to have this kind of conversation? The podcast community is like a real proper community, isn't it? Hosts talk to each other and share guests and that kind of thing. And then another thing to kind of keep the relationship going with the host is pitch them again in a while. If you've developed a new methodology or you've created this new incredible result or, something has happened that gives you a new angle for you to talk about, say, hey, I love talking to you about XYZ. What do you think about, such and such? And chances are they're going to say yes. If they, loved you as being a guest and all of that, it's always better to rebook someone that your audience loves than take a chance with somebody new. So you could be doing that. And then for kind of making the most of the episode, repurpose. Use that episode everywhere. So you could be turning it into carousels on Instagram. You could be sharing like the reel, if they give you like a video snippet, that kind of thing. Sharing with your email list. So one of the things that I do for podcast episodes is I link to them in like my welcome sequence, and people join my email list. It's such a nice way to kind of give back to the host and introduce new people, but it also gives new people to your world a chance to go deeper really quickly, not just waiting for more emails. And there's tons of other ways as well, but there's, a few kind of ways that you can use it.
Yeah, well, and I love the first one you mentioned. Make sure you just simply thank the host for having you on the show. I think there's a ton of opportunities that people don't realize and I know a lot of people who their strategy is it doesn't really matter the podcast if the host or the host company is a potential client of theirs. It's a goal of theirs to get on that podcast so that they can develop the relationship with the host, not necessarily the audience. If there's people in the audience who benefit from hearing them and that might become clients or leads, that's great. But their end goal is to be closer with the host and possibly help the host or be part of the host network, knowing that that host is connected with people in your target niche. Does your strategy differ if you're targeting more of being, cozy with the host versus the audience?
I wouldn't say so. I think you still need to, if you're thinking of the host either as a potential client or a referral partner or something like that, you're still going to need to hit the same points. It's still about showing credibility, bringing people in. You're creating trust around three things. You're creating trust for you as the expert, for your offer as like the way to deliver that transformation, and for your movement. Like people want to connect with you on an identity level and shared beliefs. And this is the way we do things around here. Anyone that, like whatever it is that you do, there are a billion other people that do the same thing, but they do it in a different way. So, they bring a different personality or they bring different beliefs or a different methodology, whatever it is. So you really just want to set yourself apart by being super clear on yourself, your offer, and your movement.
Absolutely. And do you find that with that strategy, I know it can be very beneficial to be tied into the networks of other podcast hosts. Is that something do you recommend people use that strategy for being more cozy with the host than just the audience, or does it matter? Is it really just a matter of what your business
Both really
is?
valuable.
Yeah.
But I think there's maybe a distinction in business that if you sell really high ticket or something really specific, so referral networks and kind of your name being passed around rooms that you're not in, that's more valuable for you than but the host relationship is going to be more valuable. But if you're selling, you can for sure sell high ticket to listeners as well. Most people are going to want to do both, right? The ideal is you're selling to listeners and you're also giving so much value in the conversation that the host remembers you and they're like, oh yeah, like one of my clients recently had her podcast interview And at the end of the podcast, the host said to her, "That was so good. I would love to hire you to come in and do a session in my mastermind with my clients," and saw her as a value add to, in that way. So there's endless opportunities for it. So you just want to bring your A game, bring your value. Yeah.
And there's no better warm intro to a possible gig or client or connection than being on their show, right? Like where else are you going to get the opportunity to chat with someone for 15 minutes to an hour about what you are an expert in, especially if that host could use what you're the expert in? There's really no better way to do it.
And you get all like the green room bit, the beginning and the end, you get all the chat and like how you doing, you find out a bit about each other's lives. So, there's that personal connection as well.
Yep. That's awesome. We mentioned a couple times earlier being seen on Google and having your episodes mentioned as it pertains to like SEO. Can you give us some details on the importance of that? I really want to stress that because I think it's really important to be found credible by Google and the accompanying search engines. Can you give us some details on how important that is or ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think there's two main ways that you can get found on Google. So the long game is whenever anyone Googles, how do I speak on podcasts or how do I get booked on podcasts, your name pops up. Obviously, that's incredible. Takes a bit longer. But the real quick win is when somebody Googles your name or your company name and all this social proof, that's the first things they see on Google. And you want, at least the whole first page to be directly related to your current expertise, not kind of old jobs or side gigs or anything like that, but really dialed in on what you're doing now. And one of the best ways to do that is just to talk about it again and again and again, on podcasts and wherever it is you can, but podcasts are obviously incredible for SEO.
And I guess kind of how is, not to say that you're an expert on Google algorithms, maybe you are, I don't know if you are, that's a benefit, but
no, I'm not.
But how have you seen the effect for you and for your clients? It seems to have placed more importance on just being mentioned places. So even if you're, if you're on a podcast and it's distributed everywhere on Apple and Spotify, et cetera, Google picks up on everywhere you're mentioned, right? Is that something where because you're even mentioned on Spotify, regardless of the listenership of that specific podcast, is Google going to pick up on the fact that you are listed and mentioned on Spotify or on Apple?
Yeah. So one of my clients came to me when he was starting a brand new online business. He'd had an offline business before, but no online presence at all. And that was one of his really key objectives of wanting to speak on podcasts was get findable on Google. So when he booked a sales call with me, I Googled him and didn't find anything. It was like, he had really good reasons for it and all of that. Brought him on as a client. Within 6 weeks, when you Googled his name or his company name, the entire first few features, like listings, whatever, were about him. So straight away, there's that level of credibility, even offline. If people are wanting to go to his kind of brick and mortar business, they're still going to Google, and having that presence, it just adds all this layer of trustworthiness and credibility. And, this person really is who they say they are.
And I think that helps you become a league of your own, like you mentioned earlier in the show. If you can Google yourself and own the first page, imagine if somebody who is potentially one of your future clients Googles you and you own the first page through so many different sources that you've been mentioned or that you've been featured on. Just the authority that lends you is through the roof, right?
Absolutely. And it's so much more authority than having a lot of social media followers. Having lots of social media followers, there is authority to that for sure. There is some social proof to that, but it's not the same as building your brand beyond social media and having the presence on social media and beyond, especially if you are doing something that is where your ideal clients care a lot less about social media. So if you're a consultant or if you're selling B2C or B2B in a kind of more higher ticket way, so it's not so much volume, it's much more about, buyer discernment, and they've got a very particular kind of buyer journey. Speaking on podcasts and building a personal brand far beyond social media and really tapping into that power of somebody Googles you, like, oh my God, they've done this, they've spoken there, they know this person, all of that. And also you can see the number of years very easily that somebody's been doing something. There's credibility, that longevity.
Yeah,
all that good stuff.
That's the thing. You last forever. Once you're on a podcast, you are registered in Spotify and Apple and all pod players that you have shown up here. You have been mentioned and you were interviewed. That's something where on social media, Facebook can just kick you off the platform whenever they want. And you could have thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of followers, but you could lose your audience in a flash, right? But with being a guest on a podcast and having mentions across the board on different websites and different pod players, YouTube, if it's a visual podcast, algorithm can take that from you, right? Like you're going to be present on those webs. Unless the internet goes away, you're going to be present on the internet if you keep spreading your seed and, diversifying where you're showing up. So I think that was a great point to make, that a lot of people think, oh, I just need to go be a TikTok star. And not necessarily the case. If you can go talk about who you are and what you do on podcasts, it's such a better way in tandem with social media, sure. But also, like you said, if you deal with people who don't necessarily live on social media, you got to be somewhere. You might as well own the first page of Google.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as we start to wrap it up here, I want to kind of get your opinions on the timeline. You shared a story of where there's a guy who had kind of zero mentions, zero following, zero presence on the internet. And within, I think you said 6 weeks or so, he had a lot of things going for him. Especially if you're following your prescriptions here, but for anyone who's getting into podcast guesting, this isn't necessarily a get rich quick overnight thing at all. What do you say when people ask you, how long could it possibly take me to start seeing traction with using podcast guesting as a ways and means to build my business?
So I think for some people, they literally start signing clients from their very first interview. And it depends on your positioning, the strength of it. If you're speaking on a podcast and you've already got a bit of an established personal brand and you've got really tight stories to tell and strong positioning, then the chances of you doing that are, really good. If you're a bit newer and you don't have all those things in place yet, you're building them. So it's still incredibly valuable, but it's just that maybe you don't sign a client that day, but maybe you are going to get a introduction to another podcast. It'd be great to have you on. Maybe you're building your online presence. It's still really worth doing. And for those people, it's really hard to say, but between kind of 90 days and 6 months, if you're kind of working on it consistently, it might be slower kind of off the ground and posting on Instagram, but you're going to see outsized results. It compounds in a way that most other kinds of marketing don't compound in quite the same way.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're on a podcast on Monday, you could have someone reaching out to you on Tuesday or whenever they launch the episode, right? It can work fast, but it is still, like you said, a long-term play where you got to be consistent. And I think that's true for so many different things when you're growing a business, is being consistent, but especially when you're podcasting. It's not just about being on 1 or 2 a year. If you're going to make this part of your strategy, you got to stay after it. Always be pitching, right? And the more pitches you send, the more shows you're going to be on.
And then you get amazing invitations and you don't have to pitch every time. And,
Right.
it takes on a life of its own.
Yep.
Kind of, you do more of it. Yeah, it gets easier.
That's the other important thing about being on more shows is now when there's other podcast hosts out there that are looking to fill their slots, if you own the first page of Google or if you have a whole lot of mentions and you have a couple great episodes under your belt, now you're a much more attractive person to have on a show, regardless of the size, right? So it's the social proof is there, or the physical proof of you being on these shows is there, and it starts snowballing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
It's a good word for it.
Well, Natalie, that's probably a good place to land the plane here. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for all your detailed information on how to start guesting on a podcast to grow your business. I want to make sure that anybody listening today, if they'd like to get in contact with you, check out your program, or if they're just somebody they need help to start guesting on podcasts, what is the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, so the best way is my website is nataliekoussa.com. And if you go to /league, there is a private podcast there called A League of Your Own. And it's just more of a deep dive of how to go about speaking on podcasts and, what the benefits of speaking on podcasts are. So it's the best way to do it.
I love it. Awesome. Well, Natalie, thank you again. This has been wonderful. So much valuable information. We wish you nothing but the best moving forward. And thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's been great.